Welcome, Eric. It's been a lot of fun. I actually remember covering insurance back in 2003, and it was a very different world at that point.
Yep.
So why don't we start off a little bit with your introduction, what you do, your role at Allstate, your background, and what you're currently responsible for.
Sure. So I'm Allstate's Chief Data Officer, and I lead a team of folks really specializing in data governance, making sure we have data available when, where, and how we need it to make better business decisions and better serve our customers, as well as a pretty large data science group, somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 or so data scientists as well. Not necessarily doing all of the data science work throughout the enterprise, but really that core data science hub within Allstate as well.
That's actually very interesting. 200 people?
Yep.
Perhaps in just a framework, what do these 200 people do on a day-to-day basis? Like, is a lot of their time to do data cleanup? Like, give me some kind of a structure around this team. I'm pretty amazed at that.
Yeah, so we've got a number of different roles within the team, right? So some are focused very much on data governance. Some are focused on data engineering. We've got folks, like I said, focused on data science. And then our scope is pretty broad. So if you think of problems that a company like Allstate would face, we've got, kind of our fingers in all of those pies in one way or another. So everything from helping make sure our marketing is efficient and effective, working with the sales department to make sure we're having good, effective interactions with consumers in the sales space. Operations, claims is a big area of focus for us. So it kind of runs the gamut of the insurance value chain.
So say at the highest level, when you make your business plan, what are some of the top things that you want to achieve with AI, let's say over the next 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, so I think, when we think about AI, it's always in the context of Allstate's broader strategy, right? And what Allstate does and what we aspire to do is provide consumers with simple, affordable, connected protection. Do that in a way that sort of recognizes them as individuals, understands their situation, and it best serve them when, where, and how they want to be served. So that AI strategy is really anchored on that business strategy more broadly, and then we really think of AI as just a new set of tools to deliver on that value proposition in a way that's hopefully more effective than it has been in the past.
So one of the areas that I have heard is customer service. Just people are absolutely dying to use it in that framework. I'm sure given, claims and all the stuff that goes for insurance, give us a little bit of background of what's happening at Allstate with customer service, across the entire gamut.
Yeah, I think there's maybe 2 categories of that. So I think first off, it's making interactions hopefully simpler, faster, and then more cost efficient in a way that allows us to provide that savings back to consumers. So I've certainly, and I'm sure everyone in the room has had a situation where they just want what seems to be a straightforward bit of information or a fact about whatever service or product they're purchasing, and you end up on a website and seems like you're searching forever. And I do search forever because talking to a human is like the last thing I want to do. Or if you call in, right, and you wait on hold, or you get transferred, and each time you get transferred, you've got to kind of start over. I think with the power of AI, hopefully that eliminates a lot of that, right? So those are things like chatbots if you're in digital channels, or if you're getting transferred either across channels or through human channels, things like summarization and some of the new Gen AI tools, right, where the next interaction point can kind of pick right up for where the last one ended.
I personally have seen a massive improvement in the chatbot experience over the last few years. I don't think it's because of Gen AI. I think it's just natural progression of that.
Yep.
Do you have any stats or in terms of when did you start using that? How has it evolved? I was reading somewhere around 30 to 50% of the inquiries that can just be answered initially through that, the easy stuff.
Yep.
How's your experience been with that?
Yeah, certainly we're still on that journey, I think. But I think that number doesn't sound crazy to me, right? And I kind of think of, even with traditional sort of NLP techniques, right? You kind of had to teach the machine English before you taught it your subject matter that you needed it to know. when we start getting into large language models, they kind of come built in with that understanding of language. And so certainly it's much faster to train models. You can get sort of more things contemplated into that machinery much more quickly. And so that power we're just starting to harness, but we think that's going to be huge in terms of efficiency.
So what real-world applications are you seeing actually at Allstate right now with some of these AI, NLP, Gen AI technologies, and have you seen any changes in productivity through it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's tools, even people in roles like mine that get more efficient, right? I think all of a sudden, it felt like half of my day was responding to emails. Like you can kind of push a button now and have that email created on your behalf, and you just kind of proofread it and send it. So I think even in what we've traditionally thought of as sort of white-collar jobs, I think you're seeing a lot of automation opportunities, and you're starting to see that hit the market already. I think, I mentioned summarization as a big sort of new capability. A lot of people that we have in say, call center jobs, for example, they'll spend 5 minutes on the phone, and then they'll spend 10 minutes documenting what they talked about on the phone, right? And I think when you start to look at sort of the amount of time people are kind of interfacing with customers and quote unquote doing their job versus kind of documenting their job, that's going to be huge efficiency gains.
So part of my role at Bloomberg is to cover some of these larger companies, technology companies. And one of the big questions I get asked a lot is, what's the impact of that on hiring and things like that? Have you seen any changes in your behavior and your means, the department's behavior of hiring new people or how does it impact, human beings in terms of that?
Yeah. Well, I think it certainly changes the skill set you need to where, humans have comparative advantage, right? So I think in a lot of those customer-facing jobs, right, whereas today it can seem transactional. It's going to free up our representatives to actually focus on the customer and the conversation, right, as opposed to translating what they're hearing into the form they need to fill out or the things that they need to document. And so I think you'll see shifts, particularly in the customer-facing jobs, towards skills like empathy and relationship building, and that's a little bit different maybe than how some of those roles have been filled in the past.
I used to feel I'm kind of handicapped in the tech world because I don't know coding. Now I'm happy that, if I understand the business concepts, I won't need to know coding.
Yep.
Is that an area where you're seeing some kind of, improvement in hiring trends? Because it's, first of all, it's very difficult to find technology people. But have you seen any changes in your application development and kind of the backbone of your tech infrastructure?
Yep. Yeah, I empathize with that. I don't know how to code either. Yeah, it's kind of like what I said with sort of being able to generate that first draft of an email. We're kind of seeing that in the coding space, right? So I don't know that we're to the point there where it's you sort of simply tell a large language model to write all of the code, but certainly if it can get you 50% of the way there or 60% of the way there, that's a lot of efficiency gain too. And I think we're quickly getting up to those levels.
Yeah, I'm going to go back several years ago, and I found this very interesting. When IBM was pitching Watson a long time ago, they did a deal with Geico, or they wanted to figure out how they can get better loss ratios and everything. And to be honest, it didn't go anywhere at that time. I think that deal or that partnership fell apart. Do you use a lot of AI or that kind of technology to do loss ratios, analysis, and where do you think we are in that curve? And do you think companies will, or insurance companies will get a competitive edge because of that?
Yeah, I mean, in general, insurance companies, P&C insurance companies really compete, I think, at the end of the day on underwriting and claims practices, right? And clearly the customer experience on top of that is a huge part of that. But cost is such a big driver in consumer preference that if you're not good at those other things, right, you're still going to lose in the market. So I think companies are competing on AI in this space. I think there's I don't know if it's challenge is the right word, but there's some uniqueness just because of the regulated nature of the industry that I think as we get further and further into using AI, that companies have to be cognizant of and aware of, just from a risk management standpoint. But yeah, absolutely, this is going to be a sort of a core capability of insurers now and in the days to come.
Do you think it favors larger companies with a lot of data compared to, let's say, a startup with, maybe some technology, but not a whole lot of data?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, at the end of the day, and this may not be 100%, it might be a little bit of an oversimplification, but at the end of the day, the hardware is going to be commodity, right? The algorithms are going to be commodity. The same sort of technologies that Allstate buys are what everyone else can buy. It's really the data that you can run through the algorithms that is really going to bring those things to life. And I think that's just a really hard barrier to entry, even for the more sophisticated kind of tech startup insurance companies. I think we've seen that in the market.
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, I was having a call with an investor just on that topic itself. The other thing that I've seen, at least right now, is enterprises or companies are less, I say, willing to run their internal data with, open source public models at this point. Where are you in that, framework in your mind? How do you protect your own data so that the model doesn't train and goes out and benefit somebody else?
Go crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've got a whole strategy around that. I think even with some of the open source types of tools, you can kind of import those into the organization and build walls around those. And so I think as we're looking at commercial solutions, certainly we evaluate that against maybe a homegrown sort of version of an open source tool, or even a vended sort of solution that puts a wrapper around those types of things.
Yeah, I see. Any Allstate specific applications that you are thinking about that you can publicly share?
Yeah, I'll give you maybe three, and we talked about claim settlement and underwriting. So obviously, as a customer, when you're in a claim, even if that's a relatively minor accident, right, that can be a stressful moment. And so when you call your insurance company, you don't want that to feel like a transactional interaction. You don't want it to feel like you're filling out a form, right? So one of the things we've developed fairly recently is something we call Tell My Story. And instead of kind of having it's called a checklist that the rep is looking to complete, we actually just let the customer tell us what happened, right, in their own words. And then we're using sort of NLP to then extract from their story those facts. And again, as I mentioned earlier, because we're doing that, then that representative is focused on, being empathetic, helping the customer through that moment more than just kind of note-taking. Another example, and this is kind of in various stages of development, one of the first decisions we have to make as a company after that accident is reported is we have to decide whether we're going to fix that car or whether we're going to total that car, right? And that's a big decision that we have to make, because if we route it in the wrong direction, it's going to take longer to get that customer back on their way. It's also going to cost more, right? And that ultimately that additional cost gets passed back to consumers. So we've had models in this space to help us make those decisions in the past. More recently, we're starting to test out machine vision models, right, where we're adding images of the vehicles to our more traditional structured data, and we're seeing power in that. And then maybe one last example, in the homeowners insurance space, when a customer comes to us and wants homeowners insurance, one of the things we've traditionally done is we've sent someone out to inspect the house, right? So we want to make sure the house is as described. We want to make sure the house isn't currently on fire, right, or has other condition issues. And that's not the greatest customer experience, right? Because a lot of time it kind of leaves you in the lurch on knowing whether we're actually going to insure you or not. You've got a human who's out doing measurements on your house and kind of walking around the place. Now we're using aerial imagery, right? And we can kind of do that process from a centralized location, right? So that gives you huge efficiency gains. But we're also, exploring machine vision to actually even take sort of that centralized human effort out. And that will allow us to give, instantaneous or near instantaneous decisions to customers so that when they're done with that interaction, they'll know if they're insured for sure or not.
Yeah, no focus on the homeowner's part, because it irritates me that, several neighbors will go out and claim their roof is broken, and I end up paying the bill later on.
Yep. Well, we appreciate that.
Because the fraud detection is probably one area where I think the applications, once you have the data, would have to be, tremendous.
Yep.
I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are trying to run these models, trying to figure it out. What are some of the biggest challenges you have faced? Because I'm fairly certain, they are going through the same thing.
Yeah, one is I think more technical, right? So we've been using traditional statistical predictive models over time, even more recently, kind of traditional machine learning models, right? And in those types of models, you understand what's going in, you understand kind of what's coming out, right? And you can have a kind of a good sense, even in the machine learning space, what the model is doing. And there's sort of well-developed ways to measure things like accuracy and these types of things. Now with sort of the more sophisticated AI models, if you think of things like neural nets, it gets a little harder to tell kind of what's happening between input and output. And I'll tell you a story, and I will assure everyone that this was in the early phases of development that got nowhere near production. That's Allstate's corporate relations disclaimer. But when we were looking at the total loss vision models, what we found was that if the photo of the car was taken in a junkyard, that was highly predictive that it was going to be a total loss, right? And of course, it wasn't predictive at all, right? We were just taking photos too late in the game.
Yeah.
And it was really just seeing that it had already been totaled, right? And so that's something you had to kind of vary your process to make sure you're putting those checks in place to just make sure that the accuracy is kind of what you want it to be. And then I think because of those challenges, then I think there's this whole other kind of field of how do we think about fairness, right? Responsible AI. At Allstate, I think we've kind of taken what we've done from a model risk governance perspective and have really kind of broadened that to think about AI ethics, right? And how do we assure ourselves that we're choosing the right use cases, we have the right validation in place, we're doing the testing to make sure that there's no bias. But I think those are two challenges that, I don't know that anyone's solved just yet, but I think those are things that companies are going to have to grapple with, and I think the regulators will make sure we grapple with it.
Yeah, I remember listening to a podcast just about a month and a half ago between Bill Gates and Sam Altman, and they had asked some of these questions. So how does that neural network work? And both of them didn't have the answer. I was like, wow, this is not good. If these guys can't figure it out, it's going to be a nightmare for a lot of us.
Yep.
I spend my entire day trying to figure some of this stuff out, and you have professionals who do this for a living. I mean, I luckily don't do this for a living. So how do you even keep on top of this stuff? I mean, this is completely, impossible. For a lot of what I get is news and chatter, but for you it has to be technical and accurate.
Yep.
So how do you filter from the junk?
Yeah, it's crazy. Just the learning cycles are so much faster than when I was young. So I think there's a couple things we do. One is we have strategic partners that are frequently the developers of these types of tools and technologies, and so we keep in close contact with them to make sure we're understanding if they know something, even if it isn't perfect knowledge, but we make sure we know it. We have partnerships with universities, for example, to make sure we're staying on top of what may come next, right? Like large language models, I think, exploded onto the scene with ChatGPT last year, but it wasn't a brand new concept, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't a decade-old concept, or at least in a practical sense. But that's something we could at least foresee coming a little bit. So we do that as well, and then we also dedicate time for people to stay current. It's not official continuing ed, but you've got to almost have an in-house continuing ed program just to make sure people are staying current, because if you take a year off from learning in this space, you're ancient.
No, that's good. All right, Eric, that's our time. Thank you so much for being here today.
You bet.
And sharing your thoughts.